African-American Music and Jazz Studies at NEC. This series was launched on July 14th with a conversation with the Revolutionary Students Alliance with John V. Madden, Shayana Duran, Noga Cabo, David Norville, and Taylor Wagner, and myself to talk about the truth, reconciliation, and radical institutional reform they are passionately advocating for. You can watch that session via the NEC website by clicking on About, Cultural Equity and Belonging, and scrolling down to watch previous events. Tonight's session will also be posted on the website for those who want to revisit our session or share it with friends. This summer, we will focus our Perspectives Forum on the Black experience at NEC. Our time together provides opportunities for the NEC community to explore how we all can make a better NEC and ensure it lives up to its commitment of cultural equity and belonging. By listening to the experiences and perspectives of our students, alumni, faculty, and staff, we will explore ideas that will have a positive impact on our community and build a more hopeful future for our current and prospective students. I want to take a moment to reiterate the collective role we have to make NEC better. All of us has an obligation to stand up, and speak out. The Progressive Alumni Coalition, Students Advocating for Gender Equality, Initiative for Social Change, the Revolutionary Students Alliance, alumni, students, faculty, and staff have spoken out. I have been humbled and inspired by over 90 meetings I've had with members of the NEC community over the past 2 months. And as an alum myself, I also want to see NEC change, and I'm eager to continue to assist President Kalin in making real substantive change at NEC. Thanks again for being with us tonight. In 1969, NEC President Gunther Schuller established the Afro-American Music and Jazz Studies Department, the first nationally accredited program of its kind in the United States. The institution had established itself over its first 100 years as one of the world's leading conservatories of Western classical music. With a new institutional philosophy that experimented with a unique form of American music, he was adamant that the conservatory avoid becoming a museum and fully develop musicians with personal visions of their art. NEC's current chair of jazz studies, Ken Schaphorst, its first chair, Carl Atkins, and jazz composition alumna Susan Calkins joined me this evening for an enlightening discussion about the evolution of NEC's jazz department and its future direction. Susan Calkins, with us tonight, first came to Boston to study jazz composition at Berkeley. She earned a Bachelor of Music degree and continued with graduate studies at NEC. After completing her master's degree at NEC, she moved to Paris and worked as a composer and performer and began teaching at the American School of Modern Music and the International School of Paris. Several years later, she returned to Boston and continued her work as a music educator. And 8 years ago, she earned a Doctor of Music and Education degree from Boston University and wrote a steering dissertation on the history of jazz studies at NEC and the legacy of President Schuller. I'm also joined by Mr. Karl Atkins, who has done everything, played with everybody all around the world, but most importantly, inspired generations of jazz musicians that are having a positive impact in Boston and all over the world. He served as the first chair of the Jazz Studies Department and brings a lot of history and knowledge and love for the art form to this conversation this evening. And also we're joined by Ken Schaphorst, who is the current chair of the Jazz Studies Department, who, like Mr. Atkins, has done just about everything and everywhere, and also continues to inspire the next generation of jazz musicians. So I'm very, very humbled to be joined by all three this evening for this conversation. And again, thanks so much for being here. So First, I want to just start off by talking about Gunther Schuller's vision of jazz education and what led him to incorporate jazz at NEC. And I'd like to first turn it over to Mr. Atkins, followed by Ms. Calkins.
Well, good evening, first of all. And I'm very honored to be included in this discussion. I first met Gunther Schuller in the late 60s. And when I came to Boston doing something else, he invited me to have a discussion with him and Harvey Phillips, who was then the vice president of the Conservatory, about a vision he had relative to making the Conservatory a school that could train. I saw somewhere, maybe it was in Susan's dissertation, something about the complete musician. Gunther always believed, because he himself was a complete musician, believed that an educational institution ought to be obligated to be sure that its students were acquainted and perhaps even immersed in every form of music that was extant. And he wanted to talk about having jazz be an integral part of the programs at NEC. And that was his vision. It remained steadfast for all of the years that I knew him. And that vision, of course, had to be altered to some extent as we went forward with various kinds of economic issues, social issues, and the like. But the mainstream of that vision was to be sure that students had the opportunity to grow in music in many ways. And I think he also believed, and this was shown by his efforts to bring in more students of color, and that was part of that vision. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through.
Well, good evening, everyone. You've already kind of outlined the dates and the times that Gunther began this whole mission. Gunther was president of the Conservatory starting in 1967, and in 1968 he published his first book on jazz that I believe is still used as in jazz studies programs across the country, early jazz. And in 1969, he was successful in starting a jazz department. As far as I remember, it was in 1969, they established a jazz department. And at that point, Karl, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was just called a jazz program, a jazz studies program. It was a department. It wasn't a degree granting program at that time until another year later, when it was established as the Afro-American Music and Jazz Studies program. That was the name of the degrees that you could gain going into this department. At first, I think you started with a jazz band and then in a jazz department. But Karl, please, correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Well, that's essentially true. What we started with actually was Gunther put some scholarships on the table for us to start a chamber jazz group, a trio that would be the fulcrum of the beginnings of a full-fledged jazz program. And that trio, I'm going to remember the names, at least of a couple of them, two of the three, but maybe the third one too. Pianist who was already at the Conservatory, who I have no idea what he's doing now, his name was Ron Franson. And bass player that was brought into that trio was let me go to the drummer. Harvey Mason was the drummer.
Oh, yeah.
And the bass player was, I know him like he's my own son, but I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, that's how we started. That's the group we started with, the trio. And we went around playing and recruiting to some extent, not nationwide, but just in the general area. And it was a really fine little group. But that was the beginning ensemble that served as the basis for the program to start.
I think what's kind of remarkable about Gunther was that he kind of acted autonomously.
Excuse me, Don Pate is the bass player. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Yeah, I was just going to say that, you know, Gunther was absolutely determined, and I think he had to put a lot of pressure on the board to even establish any kind of jazz studies at the conservatory, which was a 100-year-old institution at that time. And he just pushed forward with his vision. I remember Gunther saying at one point that jazz was America's treasure, and that he insisted that it had to enter into academia and be taken as seriously as Western classical music. And I think he did everything he could, and he knew that it was going to be difficult also to get enough students in the program to make it really work. And he had this idea of going out, as Karl said, you know, going out into the community and recruiting people right from the local community. And one of the things that he did was he sent, and I'm not sure, Karl, if you were part of this, but he decided that there was a neighborhood right next to the conservatory in Roxbury, and there was a music school there, the Alma Lewis School, and he decided that he had to send teachers there and not only teach music, but also for recruiting purposes, you know, see if he could find some African-American students who would be interested in coming to the conservatory. So I think he really reached out to the community in a very big way at that time, because I think that he didn't have a lot of support from the board of directors, you know, at the conservatory at that time. And he was also involved in music education in a lot of other ways too. You know, he was instrumental at the Tanglewood Institute, which was a gathering of music educators, and he basically insisted that music education at the K through 12 level and also included jazz studies and incorporated that. The other really big thing about Gunther was that he really understood that to form the complete musician, a good program in music of any sort needed to include a strong humanities aspect of the education. And as far as I know, at the very beginning, Karl, you were teaching some jazz history courses and black music, and you taught a course on the blues, I think, and
right.
that were, but you know, from some of the interviews that I found, I also heard that, you know, that they weren't all just theoretical about music. There were also cultural studies that I don't know if that still exists at the conservatory today.
I don't know. We'd have to talk to Ken about that. But
yeah.
A big part of the early thrust was to be sure that the jazz was connected to its cultural roots, that it wasn't just about playing the music in a particular way. And so we had two levels of jazz history courses. I had courses on Black history, Afro-American history. I had courses on various aspects, religious music. I had courses in blues, those kinds of things. So all of that was designed to tie the music to its cultural roots.
So, you know, Karl, you mentioned briefly about the desire of helping to diversify the school. with the jazz department, and I'm just curious between your experiences on campus and also Susan, I'm also curious what you might have found also in your research, if you wanted to say any more about those efforts to help diversify the campus and the type of impact that might have had on the institution.
Well, I think one of the things Gunther and I were very candid with each other about, or maybe I was candid to him about, was that while I was a strong proponent of getting jazz to become an integral part of the musical environment at the conservatory, and to use that also as a way to bring students of color into the conservatory, but that I didn't want that to be the only avenue. In other words, if all we were doing was trying to recruit Black jazz musicians, then it was leaving out a whole slew, as you know, of musicians of color who did other things. And I think he took that to heart too. And with his conversations that we had with the admissions office and the recruiting teams as they existed, we were seriously looking for students of color in every genre of music. And we wanted that to be a complete package rather than just going out and saying, well, we're going to bring in more Black students in the jazz program. And the jazz program will be the avenue for them to enter the conservatory.
So, I mean, one thing I do want to talk about is that, we all refer to the department today as jazz studies. And from what I've learned in the past couple of months is that, perhaps there was not an official moment when the school changed the name of the department. And perhaps maybe, Ken and Karl and Susan, you can weigh in on this one. But from my understanding, one day the concert programs just started to say jazz studies. And that is what folks started calling it. I guess that's what ended up on the website. So I know that we've had some of our alumni that have encouraged NEC to rename the Jazz Studies department. And I'm just really curious from all of your perspectives to talk a little bit about that. And before you answer and start this discussion, I do want to remind those that are joining us on Zoom, you are able to ask a question for this group that we'll get to a little bit later. Perhaps we might add in some of your questions just depending on what comes by. And those that are watching us on YouTube Live, if you actually go to the NEC website, register for this, you would receive the Zoom information for you to then join us and be able to ask questions there. So anyway, I just wanted to turn this over to you three to kind of talk about the name of the department.
Well, I think Susan's dissertation actually in various ways sort of capsulizes the various iterations of what this program was called over the years. Again, I'm having to depend on information that might be existent in the conservatory archives and my own feeble brains to try to figure out, to try to remember, how we went about this. As I remember it, when this went to the NASM, the National Association of Schools of Music, to request a degree, it was called the Afro-American Music and Jazz Studies Department. And the jazz program was a subset of that because I think, again, Gunther's vision and mine was that this would become, a full-fledged department that looked into many aspects of African-American music, which is why that Afro-American music and jazz studies was appropriate at that point. Now, when it changed, I don't know. I'm like you, I don't have a clue. But I do remember that we had a Ford grant, Foundation grant. We had a New York State Council and Massachusetts Council of the Arts grant to bring in speakers to the program to start to move the activities and the curriculum in the area of African-American or Afro-American music, not just jazz. And that was a part of the plan to continue as we went along to expand these ideas. Of course, the conservatory started to run, as everybody knows, went into some financial issues, and a lot of things just kind of got pushed off to the side while they dealt with the financial crisis that the conservatory was going through at some of those early days. So I'm not sure how it all got mixed up in the discussions, and when things started appearing in print that didn't include Afro-American music as a part of the title for the department. Again, Susan has pulled out in her research, if I remember correctly, some programs and various kinds of documentations that showed how things were listed in programs. And sometimes they were listed as jazz studies, and sometimes they were listed as Afro-American music studies, and then sometimes the jazz program under the Afro-American music and jazz department. So it all got very, very confused after a while for everybody concerned. But that's my remembrance. My memory, again, these days is a little bit faulty, but that's my remembrance of how those discussions went. We still, in those early years, between 1969 and until probably about 74 or so, we really continued to try to focus on the Afro-American music aspect of it, so that the jazz program would not be the sole activity in the Afro-American music and jazz studies program.
Well, I did just receive a tip that Phil Wilson changed the name in 1977. So,
I'm sorry,
but perhaps let's keep this conversation. Phil Wilson.
Phil Wilson.
Phil Wilson.
Yeah.
Phil Wilson.
So, well, received that tip. Certainly, I think very credible. But we'll certainly add that to my list. But I'd still like this conversation to keep the name changed somehow. But what does that mean to all of us? So, Carl, thank you for that.
Ken, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I guess, like Susan, I've done a little research. My sense is that it happened later. I believe that Phil took over from Karl. Karl, you might remember that.
He actually took over from Jackie.
Jackie? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
But it was like 75 or 76. And I've seen the name Afro-American music in programs and catalogs well after that.
Yeah, actually, when I started in 1980, the department was Afro-American music and jazz studies at that time, although no one ever called it that. The students and the faculty all called it jazz, the jazz studies program. But it was officially still in 1980, Afro-American music and jazz studies. But along the way, I think, I think a lot of it was a function of who happened to write the programs for the concerts, or who laid out the catalog that particular year, because it seemed to just fluctuate and seemed like, there wasn't anybody that was insisting that name always remained the same. It was just kind of accepted, and somebody printed out the programs, or somebody printed out the catalog for a particular year. In fact, there were 2 years where there was no catalog at all. I think that was probably during this financial crisis. And, I think some of that may have been diluted. Also, I think it was kind of a mouthful, the title of the department. So around campus, students just kind of got used to calling it the jazz program. And so it may have just kind of morphed in that, organic way as well.
Yeah, I think there were, I'm sorry.
I mean, I just want to say, I'm interested in the name change. Karl and I have talked about this a lot. But I think I'm more interested in whether the department changed or not. So whether you call it Afro-American music or not, I think this sense that maybe we started with a focus on the culture of jazz and the culture of African-American music, and perhaps that was lost at some point. I think that there can be an argument made that that happened. I would prefer to think that we still are continuing that today, but and we can talk about that if you like. But I do think that's a more interesting discussion, actually, of just what happened when Karl left, when Gunther left. The two, I would say, architects of that first department, and they did have a very strong impulse to teach the culture of the music as well as the music itself. And I do feel, just looking back on the history, that has been lost during periods. I know Hanka Snetsky feels very strongly that he, worked hard to bring that back when he took over his chair, and I think he did. So anyway, I just throwing that out because I'm happy to talk about the name, but I think more interesting to me than that is just exactly what we're teaching and how we're teaching it.
I would agree with you. I think that's probably, I think it's a matter of the curriculum, and what students are exposed to. And especially, I mean, I don't know how, I know that when I was there, I was a master's degree student. So, a lot of the humanities courses you're not involved in at that stage of your education, because you're focusing, your music education is much more focused at that point. But I think for undergraduate students that, it might be interesting to look at the core curriculum and reincorporate some of that aspect of it, the Afro-American culture and in the core undergraduate curriculum.
So this is, thank you for engaging in this part of the dialogue. I know that we could talk about this for the next half hour. I do want to make the point, though, that there are a good number of students and alumni who are, who it means a lot to them what the name of the department is called. Now, I understand that there is a much bigger picture of what is actually taught and then actually what is felt in that teaching. And I've heard mixed stories, even from students, alum who graduated in the same year playing the same instrument, but had two different experiences, just depending on, who was their teacher. And although we could go back and trace that there were diverse aspects of making sure that the African-American culture was present in their classes, it certainly wasn't felt by some of the students that participated in some of it. Certainly, I believe the title of the department is important because that would even help keep the compass of the department as it will evolve in the future, but it will keep that compass pointed in the right direction. But I do want to lean in a little bit more to talk about the curriculum, the structures, the goals of the program, and how it has changed over time. And I'm just curious to open this up to perhaps maybe Ken, you can get us started and then we can kind of fill in on this conversation.
Sure. I mean, Susan might have the best sense of the whole sort of overarching history of the curriculum. But maybe before I get into that, I just want to say, when I said that, the name is not as important to me as the education, I just want to clarify, it's not that I don't think the name is important. And I've talked to many students about this. I'm happy to talk about it more. What I was referring to more is the question of when we stopped using that Afro-American part of it. I mean, I've probably spent as much time as Susan looking into that, why it happened, when it happened. I think the question really is, where do we go from here? And I'm very open to that discussion. So in terms of the curriculum, I mean, Karl's already talked a bit about what he was teaching at that time. There was a period there where I had very little understanding and no experience, of course, and that's where maybe Susan can fill in. I came to NEC in 1982, so a couple of years after Susan. And I was studying classical composition, but I took some of the, I took arranging with Pat Hollenbeck. I was very involved in the jazz department, writing for the different ensembles. And I would say, you know, for better or worse, I didn't sense a very strong, I don't know, Afrocentric core to the education at that time. And Susan, maybe, because I think you were there at the same time, maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't want to get into whether that's good or bad, but it's just an observation. And I, like I said, this was before Hankus took over. And I think that was in, Susan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, 1986.
I can't,
Yeah.
I'd have to go and look at my book.
I'm pretty sure
I think that's
right.
about right, though.
That's it.
So
Yeah.
that was 2 years after I graduated. I was still in Boston, and I actually worked for Hankus a little bit. I think that was one of Hankus's goals, and he changed a lot of things. And by the way, I loved my time at NEC. I wrote for the medium rare big band. I have to say that was sort of a life-changing thing. Pat Hollenbeck was helpful to me, both as a writer and also through playing my music. But I did feel when Hankus took over, because he was a student, by the way, during the time when Karl was chair, he remembered the time when Jackie Byard was teaching history, when Karl was teaching the history. And I think that was one of his goals, to bring back some elements of that education that he enjoyed so much. And I would say that has continued since that time. Now, is it the same? I wish we could bring Karl back to teach history, and but I was, you know, I've taught that the history classes. Hankus has taught them. Alan Chase has taught them. I think we all know the history of the music. Not that, you know, maybe we know as much as Karl, but I've certainly studied it. I teach that history from the perspective of the African-American role in that history. Whether students perceive that as being, you know, as paramount as it might be if Karl were talking about it is a sort of open question. But the curriculum itself, I mean, there's no way we can go through all the changes. We've added classes, we've taken away classes. I will say students today are required to take history, undergrads. They are required to take jazz history, and I'd like to think that they are introduced to the culture of the music as well as the theory and specific history. And for grad students, this is something that Alan Chase instituted. There's a course called Jazz Styles. There's a Jazz Styles Improvisation, which Brian Levy teaches, and Jazz Styles Composition, which I teach, which is basically a history of the music through the perspective or through the lens of that history. And I would say, again, whether I'm doing it well enough or not, I guess up to our students to say. But I'm certainly very conscious of the history of race and how that interacts with the history of the music. So I don't know, I've probably not answered the question at all, but that's my quick overview of how the department has changed in terms of the curriculum, and maybe in terms of how this issue of Afro-American music and focus on Afro-American music has changed. So.
Right. And let me say that you kind of allude to this, Ken, and I know what you mean by this, and that is that there certainly was a period, and I won't say it was at the Conservatory, and I will absolutely say that it was not my thought process, nor the thought processes of Jackie Byard or George Russell or any other African-American musician we had on the staff. But we really have never, and I have never had, you know, an issue with non-blacks, Caucasians, whatever, speaking about the music, because they are an important part of the music too. I mean, we're talking about jazz history. And so I remember reading in one place in Susan's book where someone said that the jazz department program didn't acknowledge the existence of white performers. And that's, you know, I would categorically deny that that was the case. And so the fact that you or any other person who's involved in the music, no matter what their color, as long as they're speaking about the music and the culture around that music in a real and honest way, and I think that's the only thing that's important. And I think we have tried, you know, I think we have gotten further and further away from just attaching the knowledge about the music to any particular group. I mean, the knowledge about the music has been widespread, and I think that's correct. I just, you know, like I said, wanted to be sure, and I've always wanted to be sure that the African-American culture, the Afro-American culture, was always, if not the seat of that discussion, certainly perhaps the most important part of the discussion about where that music started. Now, some of that has to do with perspective. There was a, what's his name? What's his name? He wrote a book on white jazz musicians. What's his name?
Sudholter.
Sudholter, yes. As a matter of fact, he had a sister who was in the program for a while. She played saxophone. She still plays, I guess. But anyway, Richard Sudholter, who plays cornet or something, you know, took umbrage at the fact that the jazz history books that had been written up to that point didn't give, in his estimation, proper due to the white musicians who were involved. And I think, you know, I said to him, I wrote him a note and I said, you know, you should have taken one of my classes. I mean, you could say that, and I'm not just the only one. There are other people around the country who were teaching courses, and I know what kinds of things they were teaching. So I guess, you know, what I'm getting at here is that we want to be careful that we don't make it a racial issue where it doesn't have to be. Yeah.
Well, this a question came in from Tyler Wagner, just about, you know, wanting to hear more specifics about kind of what NEC did to recenter the Afro-American scope. I mean, I know that we don't, I believe, I mean, we have Hankus who's listening in. I know that we can't speak on behalf of him, but Tyler specifically wanted to hear about what Hankus did to try to, again, recenter that, that scope of the department.
Ken, I think maybe you could.
Yeah, and I wish we had Hankus, but I'll do my best. Sorry, Hankus, I misrepresent you.
Well, I mean, we could.
He brought Jackie Byard back. I think the artists that he brought as guests, Randy Weston, I'm trying to think, Muhal Richard Abrams, I think that was part of how he tried to engage that history. Oh, there's Hankus.
Oh, sweet.
He can speak for himself.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Is that right? Am I unmuted? Oh my God! Now I need to put on, but I can't put on my video, so I'll just be that person with the accordion. Okay. Thank you. It's just so great to hear you guys. I just want to say it's wonderful, wonderful to hear everything you're saying. So what I would say, thank you, Ken, for raising that issue. For one thing, I mean, honestly, there were, you know, Jackie was not there when I became chair. Unfortunately, there was some incident a few years before, and the president decided to discontinue his contract. I think that when I was there, George Russell was probably the only African-American faculty member in the department that as I recall. And I hired, I hired Stanley Cowell. I hired, after Stanley left, Jerry Allen. and Saad Davis, and I hired Gary Joynes taught saxophone, as I recall. It just seemed like a department that just didn't have much of an African-American focus at that time. Cecil McBee to teach bass. I just wanted to bring back the feeling of a department that actually was a bastion of African-American culture. It just didn't make sense to me that it had become so. I would say, I hate to use the word in a sense, kind of, but Miroslav Vitus was the chair for 3 years before me, and he had a more European attitude toward the music. He was not American, and it was a different thing that he brought to it. So I feel like, I really looked to Karl not only as an incredibly inspiring teacher, but really as like almost very much like a father figure for me. I mean, and I still feel so strongly.
I'm not that old, Ankis.
But you know that it was true. I mean, because he gave me.
I'm just kidding.
I mean, I was a composition major, but he gave me saxophone lessons for like $20 or something. I mean, it was incredible, and I got to play in the bands and all that. And well, all I want to say is just remembering everything I could about what Karl did when he was there. I felt like I tried to bring that back, and I really agree with Ken that Ken has, that there's been a line since 1986, I would say, of really, it hasn't gone back to that direction anyway, where it's very European. But I feel like in the early 80s, at some point, it really kind of lost that connection. So I guess that's what I would say.
Great, thank you, Hankus. So would like to, I'm not sure if any of you want to add more to this conversation around, again, the curriculum goals of the program, and again, things that have changed over the years before moving on.
Well, again, just the business with the name is, it's a quagmire to a certain extent, because as somebody said earlier, a lot of it had to do with who was running the program at a particular time. And Phil Wilson and I were friends for many, many years. And when he was brought over by Gunther, I mean, I was out of the picture at that point. Jackie Bayard had been appointed the chair, and I had promised that I would, for at least a while, stay at Jackie's shoulders and help him through some of the administrative things, because that was not going to be his strong point. I mean, Jackie was a tremendous musician. But after a year or so, he wasn't happy with having to even deal with any of the burden of administrating. And so Gunther talked to Phil Wilson and had him come over to become chair of the department. And I think Phil had some problems with the business of the Afro-American music thing. Not that he had a problem with Afro-American music or Afro-Americans, but he just, his orientation was that the jazz department was what this probably should be called, and not this sort of long, cumbersome name. And whether or not he, as the chair of that department, could to bring to it the things that would make it continue to be an Afro-American centered kind of program, and jazz would be a part of that for sure. So I never had discussions with him after that, after he came, but he didn't stay very long, I don't think. I think he stayed 1 year. And I think that he went back to Berkeley after that 1 year. And, I don't know whether he left Berkeley and used the conservatory as a kind of leverage to get a better situation at Berkeley or what, I don't know. I never talked to him about it. But I never got the impression that he was fully committed to the program at the conservatory. You'd have to ask him.
Okay. So I'd like to move forward just a little bit to talk about how you all believe the jazz program has influenced or been influenced by the institution as a whole.
Can you repeat
Well-
the question? I'm sorry.
Go
Okay,
ahead.
so it's just, yeah, how the jazz program has influenced NEC and vice versa, how NEC has influenced the jazz program.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Carl.
Well, again, I can only speak for the time that I was there. I think once the jazz program, the Afro-American music program, was in place, it brought together in significant ways, academically and musically, musicians in the school from many different areas. And I'm not sure that there had been that number of African-American students at the conservatory at the time, so that if you went into a class, you would see more than one or two. I think back in the early days, there maybe were one or, I won't say early days, but the days prior to the establishment of this program, one or two Black students, and we know that there's a history of Black students at the conservatory going all the way back to, well, we just had Freddie Cole, who passed away. Freddie was a dear friend of mine. But I mean, I'm saying that, it wasn't significant. Now we suddenly have significant numbers, and they were coming in through this jazz program. So I think it influenced the discussions that people were beginning to have about music. And we also had the good fortune to have a couple of people in the history and theory composition departments of the conservatory who had some knowledge and affinity for the music. And they tried to incorporate that in their discussions about basic music theory. I know that Bob DiDomenico and Joe Maneri were two people who worked very, very diligently with African-American students, with every student, to talk about how this worked in comparison to what happened in the European music and so forth and so on. So I think that's one of the ways it influenced things at the conservatory. Now, they're not so dependent on the institutional decision that these things would be included, but just the individual faculty members were making sure that they wanted to talk about those things in their classes beyond just talking about European music. So I think that's one of the things. I think bringing together African-American students and other students in the conservatory in academic situations, as well as in musical situations. Although in those days, there were just, I don't know, a handful of instrumentalists, let's say, that played in the orchestra or played in the wind bands. The Black students that were there generally played in the jazz ensemble. But that's because that's where it was at that point.
I think also having the big band program, I think especially maybe the medium rare band, a lot of the players were actually classical players that participated in those ensembles. And I think that probably influenced the institution as a whole, but also the students that were in the classical program. It gave them an entry into the world of jazz, and perhaps in a different way, but I think that influenced the institution as a whole, the exchange of these different types of music. And I also think that by Gunther bringing in people like Peter Rowe and ethnomusicology and the third stream department also just solidified this sense that you could pretty much branch into any area that you wanted to as a composer, as a musician, and that sort of the world was your oyster when it came to seeking out your own personal voice as a musician at the conservatory. That was my impression as a student.
Mm-hmm. A couple of things that I'd like to just perhaps clarify. One is I'm not sure that you say anything like this, Susan, in your book. I did read it, but I don't remember everything. But that there was some tension between third stream and the jazz department, and there was some to some extent. But I always had a great affection, and to this day, still have a great affection for Rand Blake and for the thought processes that he brought to the music making process. So there really wasn't tension. I mean, there was a kind of, if anything, a kind of lobbying for space and funds and resources, because there were very few things that were there, resources that were there. The other thing has to do with the medium rare band, and we could have a whole evening's discussion perhaps about medium rare, and I don't want to get into that. But I would just simply say the medium rare was not a part of the jazz program as I ran it. They actually were a group of students led by Pat Hollenbeck, who felt that they had been left out of the discussion of jazz, and they started their own band, and that created some tensions. But it was not, medium rare was not a part of the jazz department when I was there. Now, what happened afterwards, I don't know.
So maybe I'll jump in. Stanford, I don't know how much time we have, but I mean, it was a part of the school when I was a student. So I think when Pat maybe started teaching at NEC, I don't know when that started, maybe Susan knows, but that became one of the big bands. What I remember is Pat ran the medium rare band, and then George Russell continued to lead a group. I kind of forget what it was called, but it wasn't medium rare, at least in the way I remember it. But George continued to present his music. But just to get back to Stanford's question, which is a tough one, but I'm going to try. In terms of how the conservatory has affected the jazz students or the jazz department, you know, I do think that being surrounded by classical music has had a profound effect on the students who have studied jazz at NEC. I've had so many stories of students who come to NEC. There was this trumpet player, Roberto Ruiz. It's going to make me cry just thinking about it, but you know, he's from Panama, and he had never heard an orchestra like the NEC Student Orchestra. It just blew his mind. You know, I'm sorry if there are Panamanians in the audience who will be offended by this, but I think the professional level orchestras in Panama were not playing at that level. And it just changed his life. It really made him want to be more a part of that music and work harder at playing the trumpet. And this happens every day. I occasionally ask the students, because you know they all have to take solfege, they all have to take the theory sequence right alongside the classical students. I often ask them, would you prefer to have a separate path through the theory curriculum? And I think they like that. They like learning alongside the classical students. At least when I last heard, that's part of what they enjoy about the NEC process. So I don't know, that's just one angle on that. There's many other, but I thought I should mention that. In terms of how the jazz department has affected the conservatory, maybe I'll just mention a couple of things that have happened since I've been chair. I mean, one is the Black Student Union, which started when Jason Moran came to NEC. And I think there was a group like that at Manhattan School of Music. And he felt there should be a group like that at NEC. And we worked together to make it a club, an official student activity. I think that's had a profound effect on the conservatory in recent years, actually. Certainly, it's one of the reasons that all these topics are coming up. You know, one of the fascinating things, by the way, about reading Susan's book is hearing that some of the same things came up when Karl was the chair. And there was a sort of a militant side of the student population that was really demanding a pretty radical change that Gunther was not in favor of. Someday I'd love to hear more about that, Karl. But okay, but
yeah.
But I'll just say, you know, I'm proud of the Black Student Union. I think that what they're doing, you know, it has been a great asset to the conservatory. But another thing is the gospel choir, you know, that started, you know, there, as far as I know, was not a curricular gospel choir until relatively recently. And that's, I think, again, really changed the whole culture of the conservatory. And it goes beyond just the jazz students. So I guess I just mentioning those two things. There are many, many others, but I think maybe one other. I do think that the jazz department has given the conservatory a kind of an edge that it didn't have otherwise. I think the sort of radical side, and it was very radical for Gunther to start that department when he did, made people aware of the conservatory as a place that something was going on. And I think that side of the conservatory is still in effect. When I talk to jazz musicians, they know that history. They know that George Russell taught there. And I think that has added to the conservatory as a whole, not just the jazz department. So I think that's all I'm going to say.
Right. Well, thanks, Ken. I know everything we put on the table, we could easily talk about for 45 minutes each. I do want to move on to my last question that I had for this. We'll try to get to a couple of questions here, but I think in this last question, we can try to get to some of the questions that have come forward. We understand that there are both challenges and opportunities that face the jazz studies program at NEC. And then we also understand that there are challenges and opportunity that jazz faces, itself. My understanding of jazz growing up, my father is a jazz saxophonist that studied at Indiana University with David Baker, and grew up listening to lots and lots of jazz and playing it throughout high school, and also some in college when I was in Philly. But my understanding of it was just, jazz has evolved so much, and so many other cultures have, put their stamp on it. And so I was always taught to really just embrace this ride that jazz was going on, in addition to being introduced to and really taught a lot from my father about the contributions of African Americans to starting the art form. So I kind of want to ask, again, several questions. I mean, especially moving forward, there's a lot of folks that really want to know, specifically, what can the jazz department do? Perhaps what could NEC do moving forward in terms of the curriculum, perhaps changes to the department, and so on, that could help address, I think, some of the desires that we all have of wanting to see NEC evolve as an institution, but also to respond to some of the letters that were written by the Black Student Union, even the Progressive Alumni Coalition. So I know it's kind of a big question to throw out there, but Ken, perhaps we can start with you with some specific things. Susan, I would like to go to you next to share your thoughts on this big topic. And then Karl, if you could round us out with that, and then we'll try to take a question or two that have come in.
Sure. I mean, first of all, I'm open to change always. And many of the things that were addressed in the letters that I've seen are things that I've been pushing for years. And it's not something I can change myself. Unfortunately, I don't have that kind of power. I think Karl was fortunate to have a president. And by the way, Andrea is a great president. It's not a knock on her. But I think Karl had a mandate from Gunther to address this. And I think if the conservatory as a whole decides, okay, let's just say Black American music, that's the new focus. We're going to switch from jazz to Black American music. I'm not pushing, but I'm going to say that I'd be open for that if that were a decision by the whole conservatory, by the board of directors, by the president, that that's the direction we're going to go in. I'm going to buy in, but it's not something that I can do myself. Curricular changes are something that happen every year. And there are things that happen this year that I think are addressing some of the issues that have been brought up. And I'm going to continue to work as I have for the past, almost 20 years now, addressing those issues, trying to maybe make the history more clear than it is currently. But I just want to make it clear, if we were to say move in that direction, which has been proposed, of teaching Black American music, I think we'd have to completely overhaul the curriculum. I mean, I think that, as Karl mentioned, to really address Afro-American music in earnest, I think, you know, we'd have to hire Karl and maybe 4 or 5 people like him who actually are knowledgeable and can teach that. I mean, in addition to just having a gospel choir, we should have a rhythm and blues ensemble. We should have a hip hop ensemble. I mean, that's, and by the way, all those things I'm open to, but that's not, you know, something we can do with existing faculty. Although we do address some of those issues, you know, it's not as if we're blind to that, to the openness of the music of the African diaspora. So I don't know, that is probably not going to satisfy anyone, but I guess that's my sense, that I am open to any of these things. We are working on all those things. Many of them, like recruiting more African-American students, more African-American faculty, that's something I do every day. And it's not something I'm going to stop doing. So maybe that's all I'll say for now.
Well, I think Ken is probably a better place to speak about this because I'm not working at the conservatory right now. But in my estimation, I think that what needs to be done is recruiting, number one, and I mean, you need to have, if you're going to have a Black music program, I think you should have more Black students in that program as part of the student body. Secondly, I think that the curriculum issues, and I think Ken's really addressing that very stridently. So I think that we need to just push forward in that way. I mean, you know, it was a different time with Gunther. Gunther probably used a lot of his own resources to get done what he wanted to have done, and that's not the way the conservatory functions now. So there are a lot of other powers that be that determine how this all is going to work. In addition to the fact that you have to consider what it costs to go to the conservatory and the kind of students that you can get at the conservatory. How are you going to support the students prior to their entry at the conservatory? They have to have the foundation, the musical foundation, in order to function at the conservatory. So, you know, perhaps more community outreach, which is one of those initiatives that Gunther started, but it was not long-lived, and maybe that's something that could be revisited. You know, is going out into the community more and doing more education prior to the students coming to the conservatory, and recruiting at the same time. So that's my thought.
Well, I think both Susan and Ken hit on what I think is probably the central issue with changing some of the things at the conservatory, and that is recruiting students of color. It's a kind of interesting phenomenon, and I often say to people, and I don't have with me, excuse me, this particular catalog or particular book, but there is a book of pictures, and one side of the booklet on the page has a picture of the 1970, maybe 71 jazz band, and I was conducting it at that point. The other side, it has a picture of the jazz band at the New England Conservatory in the 2000s or something like that. And the contrast is stark. If you look at the picture of the band from 1970-71, it was 3/4 African-Americans students and 1/4 white kids. I mean, the numbers may not be absolutely right, but there certainly was that kind of change. The group in the 2000s, if I remember correctly, only had one Black student in the band. So one starts to wonder, you know, where we lost the contact with bringing in Black students. largely, a lot of it had to do with finances. The students maybe were coming from circumstances where they couldn't afford to come to the conservatory, and the conservatory couldn't give them the kind of money that they needed to have in order to be students there. And the other part of it is what's a national phenomenon, both a national and an international phenomenon, and that is that the conservatory was early on one of the first schools to offer jazz activities, period. Whether we were the first to offer a jazz degree or not is some people debate and say, well, there was already a degree program at North Texas State and so forth. So I don't know whether it was or not, but the point is that that has expanded now to the point that every school, every music program, and every school of any worth has a jazz program. And so it means that for the African-American students, they have many more options now than they had back in the 60s and the 70s, early 70s. The conservatory was one of just a handful of options. So it was a little bit easier for us to recruit because they really didn't have other places to go. And the cost of the conservatory in those days, though quite substantial, was not what it is today. So I mean, it's a different ballgame. But I say that has created again a situation where recruiting students of color is going to be a task that will not be easy, because the students, the good players of color, the good players of any color, have many options now. They don't have just a few. The white kids who wanted to play jazz in the 60s and the 70s, they didn't have any more options than the black kids here because there were no programs. I mean, but if you look at some of the kids who graduated from that program in the 60s and the 70s, and we just had Alan Pasco. I was just there last year. I was happy to do a performance with him. But you look at Roger Rosenberg, you look at Bo Winokur, you look at all of these kids white kids who were really fine players. They didn't have a lot of options either. Berkeley was the option for many of these students, and if they didn't want to go to Berkeley as it was constructed at that time, a place like the conservatory was the option for them, an option for them. So recruiting is going to be, I think, a major important aspect of producing and creating an environment where the presence of African-American students in African-American music is not just glommed on, but it becomes something that becomes an integral part of the fabric of the institution, which we had started, quite frankly, when Gunther and I were there, and it went its own way.
So thank you for that. I mean, there's a couple of things I do want to address just before we close out this conversation. One is a couple of questions kind of came in. I hope people understand that tonight's conversation was about setting some context for the jazz department at NEC. Thought it was good to start again with the historical context so that we can have further conversations even later this summer and going into next academic year. So yes, later this month, we will have more representation from alumni and students that have participated in the jazz department, who will be able to give their perspectives in addition to what Mr. Atkins, Schaphorst, and Ms. Calkins are doing tonight, and hope that you all will tune in for those conversations so we can build upon what we are learning and experiencing tonight. Also want to acknowledge somebody else wanted us to acknowledge that the African-American Student Union was started by Black students before it was renamed the Black Student Union, that asked Jason Moran to be its faculty advisor. I have learned also from my conversations with faculty and other alumni that there were additional people like Ken who were involved in that work, but certainly wanted to acknowledge that. Also share a thought that came in from Jason Moran, saying, glad to hear all discuss this topic. NEC has a very specific Black revolutionary sonic history from Frederick Douglass's grandson, Joseph Douglass, and John Rosamond
Mhm.
Johnson, Florence Price, and on and on and on to Coretta Scott King and
Mhm.
Cecil Taylor. Jason is encouraging us. He continues to say, be vocal about the history and never let us forget the sacrifices each of these bold students and teachers have done to get the music to this place. It will not be easy, end quote, from Jason. Thank you for contributing that tonight. There was also something from Jeremy Sarna, who wanted to, I guess, address one of Ken's comments about gospel music at NEC, that there were 2 gospel choirs in the early 2000s that were part of the Community Collaborations Department when Calvin Hicks ran that office. So Jeremy, thank you for that contribution.
I guess, let me just jump in. I worked with Calvin a lot when he was here, and I'm aware of what he was doing. I think what I said is that there was nothing in the curriculum for the college students until the gospel choir that we started. But Jeremy's absolutely right. It wasn't as if that was the only thing in the conservatory. But thanks, Jeremy, for reminding me.
Yep. Also wanted to I'll bring up a question by Samantha Spear that asked, well, she says, thanks so much for this great discussion. Gunther is one of my greatest musical heroes. I've read almost 3 of his books and have also read portions of Dr. Calkins' dissertation. Here's my question. While Gunther was truly visionary, he often compares jazz to Western classical music to try to prove jazz legitimacy. Perhaps this was because his intended readership was often Western classical musicians. Do you think this type of comparison or holding jazz to the same standards or qualifications for excellence is harmful? If so, how can we move away from this type of thinking?
Gunther and I used to have, over the years, many conversations about jazz and third string, for example. Playing more of a devil's advocate, I said to him once, jazz is already third stream. You don't need a third stream department of it. And I was saying that more as a devil's advocate because I wanted to hear what he had to say. Again, I had a lot of respect for Rand. I think one does have to be careful to try to legitimize jazz by looking at it through the lens of classical music. In other words, if you say, well, the jazz musicians and jazz music is every bit as valid as the classical musicians, and yet put on the musicians and the music certain parameters that apply to classical music and maybe don't apply to jazz. In other words, it required a new paradigm. It required a new look at what constituted excellent music, what constituted excellent performances. I mean, I'd have people say, and I remember reading one thing in Susan's book, she didn't say it, but somebody she interviewed, said that the jazz bands couldn't read music and played out of tune. And, having just, that. No, I know you didn't say that. Somebody said it. But, I took umbrage at that only because, I had not just, but a few years before that, graduated from Indiana University with a degree, an honors degree in woodwinds, and had been touring with opera companies for a couple of years. And as a matter of fact, met Gunther while I was on tour with the American National Opera Company. So I was very keen on being sure that musicians read music and that they played in tune, given the circumstances that they found themselves in. So I think one had to be a little bit careful to use the prism of classical music to try to justify or legitimize jazz, because maybe there's a different set of rules that go on that don't apply to either of the two.
I have one other comment. I think that's great, Carl. I agree with you. But one other thought I have when I read things like that, written by Gunther or people of his generation, is I think we have to remember the world that Gunther grew up in when jazz was not taken seriously. And I think that really irked Gunther. You know, it irked me to some degree. I grew up with that too. I was told jazz was not serious music by my theory teacher in college. And I held myself back. I was, you know, ready for a fight, but I could see that was not going to go anywhere. So, you know, I think for Gunther, part of his goal was to prove to everyone that jazz was great and jazz was deserving of respect. And one way he could make that argument is to compare it to, here's a Beethoven symphony, here's a Ellington composition. You know, they are equally valid. And I think he made that point very well. I'd like to think that someday we'll be in a world where that's not necessary. And to go back to what Karl said, we can treat jazz according to its own qualities, which are unique. And you know, I think there are things in an Ellington composition that you can't really describe according to the theories of classical music. But Gunther, if anyone was prepared to do that, it was Gunther. And I think he made a pretty good case. That's I think all I want to say.
Okay, I will ask one last question. This comes from Leah Hennessy, but she says, I recognize that this panel is focused on the jazz department and appreciate that the panelists can only speak within their scope of experience. So in that light, I ask, she asks, is there more that the jazz department, faculty and staff can be doing to lead the change in culture at NEC? This has been an innovative department since its beginnings. What kind of innovations are on deck now? And perhaps this is a good question to end us on as we look towards the future.
I mean, I guess that's my call. I probably know more about what's going on, but good question, Leah. I mean, one thing we've been working on this summer that I don't know if this would have happened without the COVID situation, but one of my goals since I came to NEC was to integrate jazz and Afro-American music into the theory curriculum, which has not happened. And I think for the first time, it's going to happen this fall, actually. We've been meeting with the theory department, talking about including repertoire from the jazz and American popular music. And I'm really excited about that. I think that's going to be a huge step, very connected to what Lee is asking. I think Jason has a very exciting course that he's planning for next year, which sort of a interdisciplinary course he's going to teach with his wife. I hope this still happens with all the changes, you never know. But I think that's another example of something that's very innovative and also has the potential to really change the culture of the conservatory as a whole. I don't know, those are two things, maybe there are others, but we're working on it, Leah. I just want you to know that.
I'd like to see more women in the jazz ensembles. Well,
Right.
Me too.
Yeah, we had very few women back in the day when I was running the program. I was reminded that we did have some, but by numbers we had very few. Kathy Farmer, for example, who has gone on to international fame as a singer, was actually studying piano with Jackie Byard. We didn't really know she was much of a singer until after she left. We wish we had known now, because then she would have been involved. And then there were a couple of other women who played piano and a saxophone player. But yeah, I think that's one of the areas that could be looked at in terms of how we move forward, is how we do some recruitment from a gender standpoint. And I think that would be very important. But I think what Ken has said, and I'd certainly like to see it always advocated for it, and I think Gunther did too, which is why he hired certain kinds of people to teach, to try to fold into the regular curriculum aspects of jazz and now world music and other kinds of things that ought to be talked about when you talk to students about how music is organized, how it is presented. We've now, I hope, gotten away from the view that the Western view of writing music, playing music, presenting music is the only view, that there are all of these worldviews that need to be looked at. And that's a daunting task, because it means that the instructor has to really put themselves out there to learn about other kinds of cultures and other kinds of music. And I think Afro-American music culture is right here in our backyard, and we ought to not ignore that. And that ought to be certainly part of that growth and the influences.
Definitely.
Right. Well, I will say thank you all for your contributions tonight. I'm really excited about how this conversation will evolve, and most importantly, evolve into action. So again, I just, Susan, Ken, and Carl, thank you again for being here. For everyone that is tuning in live, thank you for sharing this evening, and those that pose questions and also comments. And also our cameo by Hankus Nevsky, thanks so much for your contribution and being put on the spot.
Thank you, Stanford. Thank you for
so
putting this
much,
together.
yes.
Yeah, and appreciate that.
Yeah,
And,
thank you, Stanford. Thanks to all the listeners, questioners.
Yeah, sure.
All right.
And
Okay,
it's nice
have a-
to see you, Carl and Ken, again.
Nice to see you,
It's
Susan.
been a while.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Have a great evening.
Okay.
Right. You
Good
as
night.
well. Thank you.
All right.
Good night.
Bye-bye.